Well, for the sake of the time management, now I'm going directly to give floor to Dr. Youna Lyons, who will talk about regulation and prevention of marine pollution in the seas of Southeast Asia, with focus on ASEAN governance, and also about the implementation of United Convention on the Law of the Sea in that specific region. Hello, Dr. Lyons. The floor is yours.
So thank you, Dr. Hong, and excellencies, colleagues, distinguished delegates, good morning and afternoon and evening to all. So may I please start by thanking the organizers for inviting me. It's an honor to be given the opportunity to take part again in this high quality conference with valuable exchange of ideas on the law of the sea. The marine environment demands our collective efforts, and building on each other's work is, I believe, critical. So in the context of the theme of this conference on regional cooperation and marine environmental protection under the UNCLOS regime, I will now share with you some of our research findings and ongoing work at the Center for International Law on the development of regional law and policy on protection of the marine environment in Southeast Asia. The question I will be discussing in this presentation is composed of three main elements. The first one is what are the legal and institutional mechanisms in place for cooperation and successful implementation of international law at regional level. Second, these implementation questions concerns in particular UNCLOS Part 12 and applicable rules of international law incorporated by reference under UNCLOS in the context of the regulation and prevention of pollution of the marine environment. Third, the geography for this investigation is the seas of Southeast Asia, all the seas of Southeast Asia. So one of the many important points that was made by Judge Peck in his keynote speech yesterday concerns the interface of law and science in the context of ensuring compliance of states with their international law obligations. And there I would like to add, especially in the context of compliance with the obligation to act with due diligence to protect the marine environment, as has been highlighted by my colleague before. So this concern over interface between law and science is actually a key underlying purpose of this presentation. We will discuss this main question in 5 steps. First, a review of the characteristic features of the seas of Southeast Asia from a geographic, ecological perspective, as well as the pollution threats that are being faced. Second, I will provide a quick overview of the legal and political institutional regional framework. Third, we will look at the instruments and mechanisms, but in priority mechanisms at regional levels with an emphasis on the institutional mechanisms. Fourth, we will compare our findings with the template, if I may say, provided by other regional seas programs. And finally, I'll conclude with some observation and reflections for further consideration, comments, and indeed, actually, a lot more work. So first, some key features of the seas of Southeast Asia. For the sake of time, I will assume, and I think that's actually a safe thing to do, that all participants are familiar with the coastal states of Southeast Asia. This map shows in black the coastal states of the seas of Southeast Asia. Laos in white is the only landlocked state. Now, what is often not as well known are the number of seas that form the seas of Southeast Asia. And there are 8 or more, depending on the scale at which they are considered. So importantly, they are all considered as marginal seas of the Pacific Ocean primarily, and also of the Indian Ocean, in particularly the Andaman Sea. The South China Sea is often focused on, as it is the largest and its regime is dominated by difficulties linked to maritime dispute that hamper collaborations. But there are many others. So the Andaman Sea along Myanmar and Thailand. And then, so whether the Gulf of Thailand is part of the South China Sea or not is another discussion. The Sulu Celebes Sea are sometimes grouped, but they are two separate and semi-enclosed sea if we're looking at the definition of Article 123, the Java Seas, etc. So the application of Article 23, which I will not discuss, you will find it actually sort of in brackets or behind, or can be applied to most of the discussions that will follow. It was discussed yesterday in an excellent presentation. So the physical and political geography are not sufficient to look at the prevention of pollution and protection of the marine environment. So this brings us to an additional layer of complexity. And this map shows you the marine ecoregions of the world, in Southeast Asia. Most of you, and this is why before I talk about the marine ecoregions, most of you I expect are more familiar with the 66 large marine ecosystems that were developed by NOAA from the US in the early 90s and have provided an important basis for the development of the Regional Seas Program and the work of UNEP and UNDP. And there are only 6 large maritime, 6 LMEs, large marine ecosystems in Southeast Asia. So the Andaman Sea is included in the Indian Ocean. The South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand are separate LMEs, but the Sulu Celebes Seas are considered as one. And the last large LMEs of Southeast Asia is all the Java Seas, which include the rest of Indonesia's archipelagic waters. Now, these marine ecoregions, which you have on the slide in front of you, provide us a different pictures, which is very useful for the management of the marine environment, including in the context of response to pollution. They are more recent than large marine ecosystems and focus on the genetic boundaries of different species. They are coming out of more recent development of application and use of genetics in marine ecology, as they are transforming our understanding of marine ecological systems. So let me give you a brief introduction to this other ecological map of the seas of Southeast Asia. So as a start, an important point is that what you are visualizing these here with the light blue lines are the ecoregions. But the ecoregions of the world are divided, in fact, in 3 levels. You have the realms, and for us in Southeast Asia, it's primarily the Indo-Pacific realms, with only Southern Java, which is part of a different one. Then you have provinces, which are a group of ecoregions, and then you have the ecoregions, which are the smallest division. So now moving to what they are, to visualize them, the South China Sea is a province that includes 3 ecoregions. So you have here the Gulf of Tonkin and Southern China, and then the deep basin of the South China Sea. The Sunda Shelf is a very large province, which include the Gulf of Thailand, southern Vietnam, then the Sunda Shelves all the way to Java, and the Strait of Malacca of Singapore up to, yeah, as you see it, up to the rest of the Andaman Sea High, which is part of another group. Now, you also have the Western Coral Triangle, which is basically the 3rd large province that includes a very large number of ecoregions. The last 3 are the small areas that are the last 3 ecoregions that are part of the outer part of the seas of Southeast Asia. So to look at the so yes, in order to progressively move back to the implementation of UNCLOS and the protection of the marine environment, let's now look at the last key features of the seas of Southeast Asia in this presentation, which is the pollution threats. So looking at what we are trying to achieve with international law, what is the science telling us on of environmental issues? At regional level, scientist reviews are all consistent to point to a number of issues. That includes pollutants at all trophic levels, which interferes with structure of communities, loss of critical habitats, adverse impacts of sediments, eutrophications, which is lack of dissolved oxygen, which prevents life in the water column, marine litter, including plastic, which is a pressing issue of this time, climate change impact, also a pressing issue. And the scientists then get to identify the following types of sources of the environmental problems that they observe. And they say that the problems are dense and increasing coastal population, rapid urbanization, intensive farming and aquaculture, shipping, excessive fishing effort and destructive fishing, etc. However, us, from our legal and policy analysis perspective, we focus on different considerations. We ask, but which type of pollution is it, and which sector of activity, which maritime zone is that in, and is it the seabed or the water column, and which responsible state is involved, and is it coastal state, flag states, or port states, and was there serious harm, and is there transboundary harm, and then if we want to add and complete the picture from a policy perspective, and the implementation also perspective is, okay, so there is a pollution, but what is the cost of that pollution? And what is the cost of the measure to repair that pollution? And what is the magnitude or the exposure of the risk? And what is the social acceptability of the measures that would have to be put in place? And so these point that moving from the scientific facts and analysis to the development of policies and the implementation of international law is not a straightforward affair. A number of additional questions need considering, and it is this link which needs work, and I would like to focus on in the context of considering the institutional legal framework. So to look at the regional institutional framework of policy and law on the management of the protection of the marine environment, let's zoom out again to the Southeast Asian region and focus first on intergovernmental organizations that involve more than 3 states. And here we're talking about intergovernmental organizations only. So I will start with the ASEAN, which is the only all-encompassing organization of Southeast Asia. It handles all ASEAN matters, including the protection of the marine environment. When looking at the seas of Southeast Asia, however, it is missing 2 coastal states, China and Timor-Leste. Now, Timor-Leste might join soon. And as for China, it is a member of the ASEAN plus China and the ASEAN plus 3. But neither of these groupings have actually institutional mechanisms to deal with the protection of the marine environment. The topic, of course, comes up in discussions and in some activities, but that are very relevant. But the focal points are primarily the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Transport in working groups that focus on implementation of the DOC and maritime consultation mechanisms. Next comes COPSI, which includes a large number of coastal states, but not all. Other state players are relevant. And I would like to finish with continue with the East Asian summits and APEX. However, they are not policy-making mechanisms as such. They're more like dialogue fora. This said, the APEC, for example, has a very active working group on ocean and fisheries and another one on chemical in the context of combating plastic that provides scientific knowledge which is useful to the protection of the marine environment and therefore the implementation of international law. But both of those also adopted a high-level declaration or action plan on combating marine debris that supports the work done by organizations such as the ASEAN and COPSI on this topic, but they are at very high level. Other state players are relevant, and they are the regional fisheries bodies that operate in parts of the seas of Southeast Asia, and yet they bring more countries and complexities to this landscape. Now, we now move to the actions of these bodies with a focus on the most developed ones institutionally, or at least the ones that are the most focused on the protection of the marine environment. So COPSI first, which was established in 1981 by the Action Plan for the Protection and Development.
I'm sorry, Dr. Lyons.
Yes?
There's some noise when you speak. Could you please, maybe you could put your mic away, a little bit away from
Okay.
your script? Okay, thank you. I'm
Okay,
sorry.
I'll have to. My apologies. So coming back to the establishment of COPSI in 1981, the aim of the COPSI was established by the Action Plan for the Protection and Development of the Marine Environment and Coastal Areas of the East Asian Seas region, and it has a main governing body, which is the Intergovernmental Meeting of the Member States. It is assisted by a secretariat, and now since 2019, it has a working group on marine litter. There is no other working group at this point, and there is no regional activity center at this point either, although there might be one that's being considered for pollution. COPSI seems to have undertaken some kind of a revival in 2 years ago, and is a very dynamic development in the context of combating marine pollution and in particular marine plastics. So we now have a regional action plan on marine litter, and more that's being contemplated in the strategic directions of for 2018-2022. However, the focus of the attention at the moment is really marine litter. So now moving to the ASEAN. I will focus here on the institutional structure in the context of the implementation of international law and policy making on the protection of the marine environment. There are many instruments, but apart from few exceptions, they are also very general and non-binding. And maybe the structure could explain at least some of this. I must add that we are currently actively working at the Center for International Law on a systematic analysis of all these instruments, and we hope to share our findings or early findings early next year. So institutionally, the ASEAN law and policy making has three important features: the pillars, the hierarchy, and ASEAN centrality. I will leave ASEAN centrality aside for today, but we're also working on it. So first, looking at the pillars, the three pillars that are the social cultural community, where the environment and the marine environment sit, the economic community that looks after sustainable development that the region needs, and political community that is the guardian of order. What the hierarchy is shown in each of the three pillars in a similar ways, with council meeting at the top, ministerial meetings on the different relevant matters, then senior official meetings below, and then working group. And where there is one, regional activity center. So the working group of choice for us with respect to marine pollution and protection of the marine environment is the Working Group on Coastal and Marine Environment. It has an extraordinarily large mandate, and it is the only one that really deals primarily with that issue, with the support, however, of the Working Group on Marine Science and Technology that you find under the Economic Community. Also in the environment, so you also have a working group on nature conservation and biodiversity, but it applies on terrestrial and marine. And in fact, one of the very strong features of the protection of the environment in the context of Southeast Asia is that it is very much a terrestrial and sea focused rather than one that is looking at the marine environment as a unit, which would be one of the fundamental difference with what original seas would do, or the mechanisms that would be developed in order to for the ASEAN to become also regional seas type mechanisms. So let's now look at the characteristic of regional seas programs. And I'll start with the Arctic Council. Why the Arctic Council? Because it's only a dialogue. Because it has some interesting comparative features with the South China Sea being also a sea which has few coastal states, but in fact the international community is very interested. You have maritime disputes and etc. Now the interesting element that has been developed by the Arctic Council, despite it not being an international organization, is a working group on protection of the Arctic marine environment, in addition to another one which is on the Arctic terrestrial environment. And under this, you have particular specific working groups on ecosystem approach, on marine protected areas, on marine pollution, including plastic, on resource exploration and development, on Arctic marine shipping, and etc. And if we now extend our look beyond to other regional seas, and this is just a small selections that are included in this slide, but you see some clear common patterns. They all start with an action plans, which is followed or not by a treaty. They have regional activity centers on oil spill preparedness and response and other pollutions, on the protection of endangered species, on biodiversity, on marine biodiversity, on marine protected areas, on dumping, and etc. So these are the features that we do not find in the context of Southeast Asia. And that leads me to my observations, and I will go straight to the more unusual features, which might be more interesting for our discussion. So there are not many regional seas region where you have a fully independent regional body that oversees most of the relevant seas, apart from the EU maybe. There's a very strong political and policy-making momentum in that body, the ASEAN, unlike in actually, when you compare with other regional seas body, it is not on par. The frequency of meetings is very great. ASEAN instruments reflect closely the evolution of international law in a competent international organization. When looking at the language of the soft law instruments, it is very clear the way they embraced international law in a way which is, again, not very typical. Now, another feature, which is an important one because it is a region which is a developing region, is that work is often driven by projects which is supported by dialogue partners and outside partners, which means outside the regions, which means a fairly fragmented type of work. And there is a limited participation of non-state actors, even at working level. These are important features that drive the way work is being done today. And so my final slide and conclusion for further reflection, which is that each institutions that has been mentioned in this presentation plays a useful role, but the coordination is unclear. So maybe a development of a complementary role or a clearer map of the way they are complementary rather than competing might be useful. A limited there is a limited development of regional scientific knowledge and a cruel need for regional databases and regional knowledge, because that's the only way to inform the implementation of international law. And the coordination of ASEAN work on the protection of the marine environment and across the working groups, maybe in an institutionalized manner might be useful. So this leads me really to the last point, and it's the main one, which is the overriding theme. We need capacity and some mechanisms to establish that missing link between international law and science. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Lyons, for your very interesting presentation. We all know that ASEAN has been attracting growing attention of the international community over the past years, so I think it is very meaningful to discuss the experience of that region. Thank you very much again.